and how we're going to kind of accomplish our goals on that. So thinking about trees in their natural environment in the forest, they grow well without us in nature, but they've got kind of, there's different environment, and urban trees, they're typically going to require a higher level of care to maintain their safety. Is the big thing we should be concerned about. You don't want any tree branches or falling on people or property, but also looking at health and aesthetics too. Improper pruning can cause damage that's going to be last for that life, the whole tree, and it could shorten the tree's lifespan there. So reasons why we want to prune trees: we can improve the aesthetic, look how the tree appears, looking at the design and activity. That's more of like the site activity, what's going on there. So if it's by the street, we're looking for clear visual areas where we can see around, utility, safety, reducing the risk of failure, and we can for plant health care, and sustainability. So planting trees, everyone likes planting trees, but I think a big thing is maintaining them, because trees have lots of benefits. We've had economic benefits. We can improve our property values. We can lower, heating, cooling costs with trees. And bigger trees kind of have more benefits than smaller trees. So pruning is a way we can maintain that on tree on the landscape for longer time. So it's an investment to plant a tree, and you want to maximize that investment. So with the proper care, we can set the tree up for success, and have a longer lifespan and lower costs in maintenance if we do some stuff early on. So back to thinking about in the differences between, you go out in the woods and you see trees in the forest, and, as opposed to a lot of, our urban trees. So in the forest, those trees are growing up and there's competition from the neighbors. So if you think about tree physiology, they're limited resources. So they're in competition for light. So they're going to grow up, and there's going to be shading from their neighbors. So those lower branches on the trees, they'll get shaded out a lot of times, depending on, tree species situations, and they'll die and fall off, and the trees are well prepared for that. But that kind of competition, typically you're driving that growth into a central leader, so that you want to have this long trunk going all the way up there. And that's going to be much more structurally sound, so it will have less issues there with that. Looking at open grown trees, without neighbors, they're not going to be driven upward. If you see some out in like a pasture or something, they're not as tall, and they kind of spread out, and they don't need to grow tall, so they grow out, kind of capturing more light that way. Lower branches and everything, because they're not shaded out. Looking at some of our urban trees here, which tend to be more open, there's not as shaded as in the forest, so not as much competition driving that up. We can have these larger lower branches that if we don't do anything about, like this one down here, we can have potential conflicts with infrastructure. We got the sidewalk here, and it's probably okay walking under, but if we got houses, we got cars and everything like that, we need to take care of that. Codominant stems can happen, and we'll talk more about that, but that's a structural kind of defect that can lead to higher probability of failure of branches and everything there. So that can shorten the lifespan of our urban trees. So these trees are gonna, for kind of long-term sustainability, need some help with pruning there. So when I go into pruning, you think about your end goal. So I like to think about when we're looking at a young tree, what do I want this tree to look like in, 20, 30 years when it's a mature tree? That's going to depend on somewhat the species. So if it's a, big shade tree, I mean, here's a sycamore, those get quite large as opposed to something small like a dogwood. So you're going to decide like, how big is this tree going to be? Where do we think the lowest branches are going to be? So deciding that. And a lot of times when you plant a tree, we can kind of permanent branches or temporary branches. All those trees, branches on a small tree are temporary branches. They're not going to be there for long term. What's kind of form of the tree is it going to take? And that's some genetic species in there. Something to think about is pruning interval. As homeowners, you've got a lot more flexibility on that. Like on my trees, I'll prune every year, every other year. Can do some dosing like that on those young trees. More municipal settings there where we're caring for large numbers of trees. They might not have the resources to come back and prune every year, so they might have, once every 5 years. So they have to get all the work done that they can in that short of time, as opposed to, spreading it out. So, all right. So thinking about some tree physiology here. So what happens to the tree when we prune it? When you're actually pruning a tree, we're creating a wound, or you're wounding the tree. We got to figure how is this going to affect tree health, and knowing how the tree is going to react can help inform some of these actions that we take. So if it's going to respond with certain growth in some way, that's going to be undesirable for our goals, we might not take that action. So thinking about when we're pruning trees, even we're taking off leaf area. We're reducing the amount of leaves, even in the wintertime, because in those buds right now on our trees, they're preformed leaves in there. And so taking them off now, in the spring when this starts growing, it's going to have fewer leaves than what it would have if we didn't do that. So we can, leaves are kind of the engine of growth and how the tree makes their food and everything through photosynthesis. Reducing leaf area can cause stress if you do too much. So trees can compensate. I know in my master's research, I looked at some of the literature on that. Like they can compensate by increasing the photosynthetic rate in their remaining leaves and compensate for those lost leaves up to a point. I think the saying at 50%, if they lose 50% of their leaves, that wouldn't go that far with pruning, losing half your trees, your growing area for that. But you're starting to get into a stress area there. So trees can compensate there. Another thing to think about is hormones. So in plants, hormones are kind of the chemical signals that the different parts of the plants use to communicate to each other. So an important hormone here, we have auxin, and that's produced in these terminal buds, and it kind of moves down the stem, and auxins will inhibit these. We've got these lateral buds here on this branch here. It will inhibit their growth. So it might tell them not to break bud. These lateral branches, it will tell them to grow slower and inhibits their growth. And then once it gets down into the roots, it kind of stimulates root growth there, tells those to grow. And there's hormone in the roots that will travel up and stimulate shoot growth. So it's kind of a balance of those two. So by pruning, this is, think of physiology. Oftentimes our young deciduous trees will have when they're younger like this, they'll have more this control. So they're more pyramidal form, as opposed to, when they get older, it turns more rounded. They lose some of that kind of control. But by pruning, we can change these signals that are going on and change the growth. So removing this auxin here, if we cut this off, if we cut it, right up here, what's going to happen? We lose this auxin signaling, not these buds to break. So then we have all these buds that can break here, and then these will increase their growth rate. And so that might not be a desirable response we want. If we wanted this to be shorter, we don't like this branch growing in this area. We just cut it here. Example is with you're mowing the lawn and you're getting hit, so you just cut up the part off that's hitting you when you're pushing the mower on the tree. But then you've kind of released all these other branches, these buds to break, and you've got 3 or 4 branches growing back in the spot where you just had one. Better thing to do would be to remove it down here and have this one take over and grow in a more desirable direction. With wounding, when we're pruning, we're wounding the tree, and that's what it is. And how do trees respond to that? So when we get a cut, we'll get a scab and it kind of heals over. Trees and plants are different. They don't kind of replace that tissue. Once that tissue's dead, it's dead. And so what trees do, the model is they compartmentalize. They want that decay, because we can get pathogens and decayed organisms inside that trunk. And the trees want to contain that to prevent it from moving on, because they can't kind of replace that cells anyway. So we've got this coded, or the compartmentalization of decay in trees, which stands for, and there's certain different walls. So the first wall is the xylem. So the xylem is those fibers. It's basically the wood fibers, and that can move, transporting water up and down. So that's kind of like a highway for different pathogens to quickly move through the tree. And the tree can it can block off those pathways there. So it's going to be a top and a bottom there in there. The wall 2 is those annual growth rings. We've all seen those when you cut a tree and you got the rings. They can have different chemicals that kind of try and block it from moving further in that decay. The wall 3 is the lateral one. So there's like cells called ray parenchyma, and they can be stimulated to put out chemicals to try and contain that as well. And the 4th one is probably easiest to see. That's on the outside, so the tree will try and grow around that wound and cut it off. So once it seals over, it cuts it off from the oxygen and will kind of stop it there. So that's going to be, there's varying strengths to these. So the 4th wall is kind of the strongest one. And it also depends on tree species. So like things like silver maple, they don't really do good job at compartmentalizing. They just rot. Things like oak is a lot better. So kind of species dependent there. All right, so with pruning, we're altering the physiology. We're changing the amount of photosynthetic area the tree has, changing the hormones. Each cut, we can potentially change that plant forever, for good or for bad. Generally, small cuts are going to do less damage than large cuts, so it's a lot easier to seal over those. Proper techniques, which we'll look at, is essential for good recovery. And then we'll look at, and again, formative pruning on these young trees is important and very economical. So you can do, as a homeowner, you can do some of these things in a couple minutes, and we avoid problems down the road you'd have to hire a professional for, and keeping that tree alive and healthy longer. So here are some types of cuts. So reduction cuts, this is where we're pruning to a lateral branch. So if we want to make the tree or bush smaller, we reduce it to a lateral branch. We're not going to cut it off in the middle there. That's not good. We want to direct growth that way. Removal cut is when we want to remove a whole branch. We're going to remove it back to the smaller of these 2 branches at the union, and we'll look at where we're going to make those cuts here for the proper healing of the tree. And then heading cuts, you typically don't do these. We looked at that why a little bit. It's like internodal cuts. We're just cutting in half. There's no lateral branches. It's going to stimulate more side growth, and which could or may not be a thing you want to do. All right, so when we're doing reduction cuts, we need to, we're cutting back to a smaller branch, but we need to make sure that smaller branch is adequate to take over that role of being the terminal role of the branch. So we should be, this lateral branch would need to be at least 1/3 the diameter of that branch. So it's coming off the main branch here. It's got to be 1/3 of that size, the diameter. If it's too small, we only have, so we've got this big branch here. If this little branch here, and we've got, you know, this is only going to produce a couple leaves, and this is going to signal it's got to have more resources than that. So what could happen, we could die back, the branch dies, and you might not want that, or it will signal the hormones to produce these more branches, and you'd have more branches growing back where you just removed them. Whereas this has enough photosynthetic to support that, and then it can channel growth in that direction. So here's an example there of a good cut there. We're just cutting right above this lateral branch. All right, so on removal cuts, we need to make sure our cut is in the right place. So some different spots. The branch collar, sometimes it can be hard to see, but it's kind of the fattening up. It's right there, kind of happens. That's where the kind of this branch tissue and the trunk tissue kind of come up. And this is the branch bark ridge, where that bark and from the branch and the main stem kind of push up against each other and form that ridge there. And so we want to make our cut just outside this branch collar. So if we, for a flush cut, it would be like this. And looking at when we said a smaller cut is going to be easier for the tree to recover from. So if we do it like this angle instead of this one going into that branch collar, one of the things, we're increasing that surface area of that wound. So this is going to be a much smaller surface area than if we cut down here. And so that's going to make it easier for the tree to seal over. So along those lines of proper cuts here, if that branch there we saw in the picture before, this one, if we're just going to cut here, we could come with a saw and start cutting down. And this tissue right here is supporting all this weight on this branch out here. And so cutting down, you're removing some of that support. And then at a certain point, probably around here, you can't, the tissue here isn't going to be able to structurally support all that weight, and it'll break. And we've got all this connected here, and we can have some ripping. So the bark is still attached, and it can rip down here and cause a bigger wound. So the proper way, this 3-cut or ternary method, we're going to go out a little way, and we're going to start. Our first cut is going to be from the bottom. We're going to cut 1/3 to about 1/4 of the way up from the bottom up with our saw. And then we're going to move out 1 inch or 2 and then start cutting from the top. And so when we reach that point of kind of failure where that structurally can't support the weight of that branch, and it breaks, we've already cut that bark from the bottom, and it just breaks off right there at that point there and does not strip the bark down. So that's important there. Then we come back with the third one, and we've removed all that weight on that branch. And so we kind of, this is what I call the cleanup cut. Here we do our final cut right outside that branch collar. So that's what we get, and it will much better for healing over and sealing on that. So again, we've got our first cut from the bottom. We move out and we start cutting from the top, and then the third cut is that cleanup cut. All right, so it can be the branch collar is important. Why we want to stay out of it. There's partially what I've mentioned with the surface area, but also the so we can kind of see here is that branch collar is thinking back to when I was talking about the kind of natural forests, you know, and those we see the branches die in nature all the time. And the tree is prepared for that. So that inside this branch collar, so this is kind of that tissue here. This is a side cut, you know, we've had the branch coming out there with the branch bark ridge. It's got kind of preformed. There's some chemicals and everything ready in there to seal over if that branch dies or if it gets broken or cut off there. So cutting into that can interrupt some of that process taking place. So here's what we call a flush cut, not good. So you see the saw above it actually nicked the bark up here. So the surface area is much larger, and it's just making it harder for that tree to seal over, grow over that wound there.
Yeah.
Here's an example of ripping, which happened here on this one, but he didn't cut it properly. Leaving stubs isn't good because two things could happen. Either it would shoot out some more branches from that stub, or it's going to die and you've got this stub sticking out, and the tree, it's an avenue for decay, and that tree's got to grow around it. You know, like when we do that pruning cut, you know, it kind of grows around it there. But if you got a stub there, that tree's got to start from this branch collar right here and grow all the way around it. And so it takes much longer time. So that happens sometimes. You see it in the woods sometimes on trees where they kind of growing around and it forms a hollow. Can be entry for pests and diseases there. And then I mentioned flush cuts there, not good. Here's some more examples of flush cut. That was really bad there. Here's an example. I like this one because they did a flush cut and they didn't cut down here, but they cut so close, we had death of tissue up above and below. And so if it was a proper cut on this young tree, that probably would have sealed over by now, but it's been taking much longer because we had extra injury on this tree. All right, so yep.
Latha, we had a question. I think it wasn't the image you were just on, but the one prior. So the stub cut should have been made closer to the tree. Is that
on this one here? Yeah, probably somewhere like right, if you see my laser pointer here, right around here is where from the picture, what I can see, you'd make that cut right around there.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, so pruning dose. So how much should you cut off a tree when you're pruning? So we don't need to. When we're pruning, we shouldn't remove more living tissue than is needed to achieve our goals, and we want to remove non-beneficial plant parts. So the things that aren't beneficial for us. So cyclical or session pruning is best. I mentioned there, if you can come back every year, every other year to do work on it, it's going to be better than trying to do a bunch of work one year, because it'd be less effect, you know, if we're taking off. If we want to have these branches up here, we can take off some lower branches one year and then kind of slowly move up on these lower branches. And it's all going to be relative to tree health and vigor. So if your tree is not growing well, if it's kind of sickly, don't prune it, because you're going to be affecting that tree health there. So let it, you know, if you need to let it recover, or if you need to do something else before you prune, so make sure it's healthy. So kind of, and it's going to depend on age. So big thing, young, fast growing things, they can say take up 50% of full length, up to 50% of that leaf area. I probably wouldn't go that high, but you can do it. But medium age trees, so these trees are, you know, larger. They're still growing, but you know, they're kind of slowing down. 25% is most you want. Mature trees, you don't want to take more than 10% off there. Mature trees, you know, they can live a long time, but you know, they're, as we age too, getting older myself and gray in the beard, takes us longer to recover. And so same thing with trees. They need it put too much stress on them. So I like to say, you know, with mature trees, good pruning on there is if you don't notice anything's been done, you know, taking minimal things off there. So that's what you want. So with these kind of these things, the under 2 inches diameter, those are not that big a deal for a tree. So kind of go ahead on that. For larger ones, 3 and 4 inches, that's big major. We gotta have a good reason. Large branches greater than 4 inches have a really good reason. Usually it's going to be related to tree health or safety. You know, if we're reducing risk of that tree, you know, branch failure or something like that. So timing of pruning, there's lots of different times you can do it. Any time the wood is not frozen, you can do dormant pruning. If you're in an area with oak wilt, you'd want to do that, you know, more before it starts growing to prevent this possible spread of that. I like to sometimes prune in the, you know, late winter because you can see the structure and make kind of decisions on that. You can also do it during the growing season. Research has shown that, you know, when it's actively growing, it have a faster recovery time there. Word on codominant stems and why we want to avoid them. So looking at this tree here, it's like a maple. So this crack right here, right down to here. So when that tree was very young, something happened, and it had 2 stems, and they're going up, and they used to be separate. And as that tree the tree grows larger, they started running into each other. These are not attached anyway. So if you've seen like that tree gets around, they're kind of pushing off each other. And we've got behind here, you know, this little crack here, we can get water infiltration in there and decay. And it's some type of maple, so it probably doesn't have resistance against decay. So this increases our risk of failure having something like this. And at this point, there's not a whole lot you can do with this tree. At some point, half of it's gonna blow down, and you're just gonna have to be removal. So here we can see the rolling of the bark here when we're doing that. Here's an example of some of that happen. This is out in the woods, but it's pretty cool. So down here we had a codominant stem, it split off, and then we had codominant stem on here that split off on there. So multiple here, and we can see this is where we didn't have that attachment, and this ripped all the way down this cherry tree. So avoiding that is important. So that's why we want to do things when the trees are young. So we can do these on small branches, and we can correct some of those defects early on. It's a lot cheaper. So smaller branches reduces wound size and healing time, and the trees are much more vigorous growing then, so it has less effects on them. We improve our branch structure, so it's and reduces these defects and potential failure. So if we have a codominant stem now, it's not going to cause us problem, but 20, 30 years down the road, it can have serious issues. So less expensive to start the tree off right. So think of an investment, and you're taking care of that. And so this diagram here, we've got temporary branches listed, and you know, lowest permanent scaffold branch. So they want branches up here. And we'll get into how we do that. So again, we want to improve non-essential parts of the tree. Dead or broken branches, crossing branches that can rub, be an avenue for disease to enter that tree. We want to maintain a central leader. So that's going to be the kind of most structurally sound form for the tree, especially for shade trees. Look at weak attachments, and then we'll talk about branch aspect ratio. So that's kind of what we're talking about, instead of, like in the past, talk about branch angles, but that aspect ratio is more important. So what that is ratio, branch aspect ratio is a ratio of the size of the branch relative to the main stem. So the branch angle is not that important. I think for this research study, they went and just put on weights on trees and see how much weight it took to break them or something. So we were like a ratio of half, 0.5 or less. So that means we want smaller branches relative to our main stem. So looking at this one, that's about the same size of line here. So this is much greater than a half. So it's, you know, probably about 80% the size of this one. So it's not right now, it's not causing anything, but it's in the future has got a potential. So this larger branch, we think about photosynthetic area, it's got a lot of leaves on there, pretty similar to that. And as they grow with all that photosynthetic area, they're gonna turn into codominant stems like this. These smaller branches here, less leaf area, they're gonna grow slower. Not really concerned on there at this point. So this is something you would want to take care of, address now. And there's several ways we could do that. So we could do reduction and heading cuts, because sometimes I'll show something. I always like to say, how do you know, if you don't want to cut off that whole thing at once, we can do it in stages. And so say, how do you shrink a branch? How do you make this branch smaller relative to the main stem? We remove some of the photosynthetic area that's attached to this branch. We remove some branches through reduction. It's less leaf area, so less photosynthesis, less growth here. And so we're getting more growth relative to that. And so it'll kind of reduce the importance of this, and we can possibly remove it later on. So what that does, we slow the branch down. So like this one right here, this branch here on the tree, it's growing up, but it was a fairly large branch. And if I take off some of that, kind of slow that down, and then in a year or two, I'd remove it. We can also use it to direct growth if we want it growing out and not up, or a certain information direction. All right, so with removal cuts, we can use that to maintain a central leader. We can improve branch spacing, remove some of these broken or damaged branches. Clearance too. So think in yards, walking, mowing, that sort of thing. So one thing for clearance is crown raising. This is the selective removal of branches to provide vertical clearance. So we're removing some of these here. Some of the connected to the trunk. And we've got there's kind of general rule of 1/3, 2/3. So we want at least 2/3 of that crown to be covered, or the height of that tree to have live branches on it. And so, that when we're looking at young trees, that's going to change through the years as the tree grows up. So like here on this tree, this is before and this is after. So it's like in a park, but we just took off those lower branches and provide better visibility, better, able to get around and mowing. But we need to consider live crown ratio. So that 1/3, 2/3. So you might come back as that tree grows, so this might be that 1/3 of the height of the tree right now. But in a couple years, as a tree grows, it might be up here. And so we could remove those at that time. And so a lot of people, they just do the crown raising on the trees. And so here's a white oak in Tipton County. And so they just removed these branches up to a point and we got around it. And but we can have some issues here. We've got, it's open grown, so it's kind of more rounded crown happening here. We got this branch here, and this is kind of our main leader in the competition. And we've got a mess of branches here. So this started out as, I think, like 4 branches, and they've all kind of grown together. And so taking care of that earlier with correct spacing would have solved issues, because not a whole lot you can do right now, because if you cut all that off right here, you'd have this big wound there. So not sure what to do with that one now. So here's an example of this tree. This is now 8 years ago on this tree. This is a bur oak. And so I didn't plant the tree, but so this is ready to go. So there's some issues here. So I did my 1/3. There's about 1/3 of the height there. So everything below here we can remove. I'm not sure who did this. We just moved in to the house, but someone bent this branch here. So I just want to take that off because it's being funky. And then up on top here, we've got like 4 or 5 branches that might try and become the leader. So I wanted to take care of that. So, you know, it took me about 10-15 minutes or less. These were fairly small branches. I just used my pruners, remove those, remove this branch, and have one single leader there. And so doing that kind of helped this tree. This is just that year. And so here it is again, looking at the tree. So it's grown some, it might be a year or 2 later. So this is about the 1/3 line. So I can remove like 1 lower branch. The branch spacing looks okay. This one, I would like to say, going back, I don't think this tree that's probably about 6 foot right there where my pointer is. I don't have any permanent branches on this one. These are all temporary branches, but you know, we can't take them off yet, or else there wouldn't be any leaves. So there's about our 1/3 line there. And everything looks okay here. We've got like 3 leaders growing out there, so that could be an issue. And so I ended up just taking off the bottom couple branches here. I left those because you totally, and don't pay attention to that ladder there, because that wouldn't be safe to go climb up the ladder, try and prune off those things. I wasn't sure about some of these branches. They're alive. They're still fairly small. So I figured I'd give it a year and see what the tree was wanting to do, and then sort it out. It's in my yard, so I have that flexibility there. So here, back at a couple years later, I think this is a different time. So it's growing pretty well. I think I sorted out, but doing more round raising here, and we're doing okay right here. We might have some issues. And then this is a year later. So we got some potential issues here with some of these with the leader. So yeah, here's what I did. So here's before and here's after. So this branch was kind of concerning me as growing up there for competition for the leader. The aspect ratio was off. This one was okay, it's much smaller. So I left that. So I took that off and did the crown raising here. So I took that up there. And I used a pole saw there. I didn't try and get on the ladder. I think, yeah, this was last year. So we're pretty good. I think I removed another couple branches here, so I can get around it with the riding mower now. Easy without hitting branches. And then we had this branch right here that I removed here. So we're left there. So at a certain point, I mean, I've been using the pole saw, but I'll give up on trying to maintain a central leader. It's going to be most important lower down. As you go up, it's going to be less and less important on that. So, you know, we're probably about 6 or 7 feet is where that point is. And I don't know, I would prefer like 10 feet for the bottom branch. Here's another example. Here's some sort of weird hybrid butternut or something. I didn't plant this one, but it was wanting to be more of a bush. So it had a stake in there, and I took it out because I didn't really need it. But this is what I wanted to be the central leader. And I got this one branch here that grew like 6 feet in a year, and we had other things growing off there. So it's trying to be more of a bush. So this is kind of a big branch here that grew there, and I didn't really want to take it all off in 1 year have a big scar there. So I wanted to funnel more of that growth up. So I did some of this internodal cuts there, these heading cuts on there to kind of reduce some of that and have more growth up there. So here's kind of afterwards what we have there, and then I took out that pole. So this is like a year later. It's growing much better. This branch is back here, can be an issue there with that aspect ratio, but it's looking much better there. And I eventually took off this one branch the next year there. So this is a couple years later. And here is it again. I think this was this last spring. I did this work, and we've got in the back here, or maybe this was yeah. So that's what it's at. This was this last spring. Different flowers out and everything, so different time. So this branch right here is my main concern, but we've got you know, the central leader going up this way, but this branch here, look at that aspect ratio, and it's low down, and I've been doing reduction cuts on it, and I finally decided at some point we were going to remove it. So I took this one out on there, got it outside that branch collar to get the smaller kind of surface area for that wound. And so that tree's looks a lot nicer now. This is another one that wanted to be a bush. I had done some work on it previously. It had like 3 or 4 branches that are growing out like this because the central leader died instead of like 4 of them. And so I picked this one. They were all at this kind of, you see this crazy angle here. They were all about like this. There's a pruning wound there. But I picked this one, and you can kind of see how the tree sort of straightens itself out. There's just a little crook in there, but this is the last one left. I'd been kind of reducing it on it. So this was gonna reduce. So what I did, I removed this one, did a removal cut, and there's this branch kind of growing out here. So I wanted my leader going up this way, and this one was kind of competing with that. So I did a reduction cut here. We see it removed there on there. So much more like a tree now than a bush. So it's progressing nicely. So wrapping it up, the big things when you're looking at these young trees, you know, if you planted, we want to maintain that central leader. We can use different things, tools to kind of subordinate branches, kind of fix things through those reduction cuts, which I demonstrated, and also, you know, removal cuts on there to maintain those. But that's kind of how I go about pruning on those. So we've got time for questions now, I guess.
We appreciate it, Phil. Yep, if you guys have questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat box. I've had the opportunity to actually watch Phil do an analysis of a tree in terms of safety, and I'll tell you right up, the first thing I think of is every single tree is different because of the location, the species. I will say that if you do approach an extension educator, one question you shouldn't ask is, well, how do I cut my tree down? Or what do I do with my tree? That's a little too open-ended. There's a lot of variables to it. So when pruning, always be safe. And again, there are ways to help, like Phil had talked about, keep your tree healthy while pruning it. As we kind of get our questions in, I did have one. Which is the worst tree in terms of pruning as far as upkeep that you've seen?
Well, so the worst tree that you got to do the most work with is silver maple. I would say don't plant silver maple. They maples in general like to put on maples in general you have to watch because it's very common for them to have multiple leaders on them, so you got to watch them. But silver maples, they grow so fast they can get away from you. My mother-in-law sprouted one of those silver maple trees, and she's like, "Oh, I want to plant it." And it's like, you don't really want to. And so, but she did. So I go and prune that tree, and they grow so fast, and it's got a central leader up through I don't know 10, 20 feet. So but it took like every year having to go because they grow so fast. And the bad thing about silver maple, they don't have any good, they don't compartmentalize, they rot super easy. So we see it, but it's one of the most common kind of urban trees because it grows fast and it's kind of pretty with the yellow leaves, but it's kind of it can be a nightmare with dealing with rotting and breakage and everything for it.
We have plenty of those in Wabash County, that's for sure. I was also going to mention, when I was working in the nursery business, we would spend days trimming people's crabapple trees because they had those, I forget if they call them lateral or what they are, just those straight up branches that don't do anything and they take up all the space.
Yeah, water sprouts go
Yeah,
straight up.
yeah. We did have a question here. Which is the best oak to plant in northern Indiana?
It's going to depend on your site. So, soil conditions and everything there. So if it's wet, and then also like can be with soil pH. So some good ones, depending on site. So like pin oak is very popular, but you have to watch your soil pH because their natural habitat is kind of wet areas, which tend to have a lower pH. And if you're on a higher pH site, they can have trouble with taking up iron. So they get that yellow look to them. Other good ones, northern red oak, that's a good one. It can grow fairly good growth rate. I like bur oak. That's fairly adaptable on site. Another popular one is a swamp white oak. All this says swamp white oak, take wet conditions, but it grows fine if there's adequate moisture. Other ones like white oak has a very long-lived species. That's a good one. And another popular one become popular is chinkapin oak. So there's lots of options. So, but you'd have to looking at your site, what the moisture conditions are and the soil pH, pick out the best one.
Excellent. We did have another one. This one is, are King Crimson maples any better than silver maples?
Crimson King, so that'd be those kind of red. Those are Norway maples, a species. They have a lot of issues and problems. One issue, they're non-native and they can be invasive, so that's one issue. It seems to me that another problem with maples is they tend to have girdling roots, which is another issue, which we'll not get too far into. But it just seems with Norway maple, they reach a certain size and they just kind of fall apart, disease and everything there. So on the whole, probably they last longer than silver maple, but not the greatest. Maple trees, if you're looking at maple, red maple is good. It'll be a smaller one, a little higher growth rate, as opposed to we've got sugar maple. It's going to be a slower growth rate, but it's going to be kind of a long-lived tree. And so kind of that'd be last longer in the environment and everything there. So, but there's a lot of different varieties out there, like cultivars, and they've got hybrid ones with some of those, like the Autumn Blaze maple, and that's a hybrid between silver and red. So you got to watch those because they got one of their parents was a silver maple, so they got some of those tendencies to them.
We did have a question too about if you could explain the aspect ratio Just another quick run through that, and then if there's any simple rules of thumb on that.
All right, let me get back to the. Go back. Let me see. Oh, it's not. So
Yeah,
yeah, my computer's ready. Can you still hear me?
it's getting choppy.
Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yes, it's getting choppy, but we'll see if we can limp through the last few minutes. So I cannot hear you, Phil. So while this, I have no idea if you guys can hear me either. If you guys who are on while we're trying to get the system back up, I did put the post survey link in the chat box. Every time you guys, okay, you can hear Jeff. So if you don't mind working on the survey, we'll see if we can get Phil back in it. You might have to exit and come. Oh, he moved. But that link helps us out quite a bit. Okay. I don't know if his internet must be choppy. We'll give it a few more minutes so we can have the full time till noon. Kirk, your question in the chat box about best trees we might consider planting in Indiana. There are some, did you have to get a request to fill out the survey? Marty, I'm sorry. I promised I would do better. I can do this. Well, had to have a few hiccups.